Welcome to the start of the summer season for me. Looking at Dr. Stone today, the manga about people being stuck in stone for thousands of years until suddenly they're not. To mark off the summer season, of course, today's a cold and wet, rainy day. Just a brief look at this anime before we get started. The director is the director who previously directed, was it like an episode director on shows like Barakamon, Kuma Miko, Made in Abyss. He was an assistant director on, I think, and the main boy. The voice of the main character is basically like the only thing I recognize him from is from being Subaru in ReZero. So if you found his voice annoying at all, you know what you're going to be listening to for the next 24 to 25 episodes before this gets renewed. Obviously, it will. It's a super popular show. So the basic premise of the show we already know about. The only thing I know about is from the PVs. I haven't really watched anything else or read any of the manga. I like to go into it with just like a clean slate. So without further ado, let's get started. So that was episode 1 of Dr. Stone. I kind of knew about the basic premise of the show, and I'm trying a new format where I just review it all in one go this time. I think I used to do that more before, but I kind of got stuck in reacting to stuff that happened in the moment, so the review maybe wasn't as all-encompassing as it maybe should be. So let's start off right from the top, right? Let's talk about voice actors. The main character is voiced by the guy who did the voice for Subaru from ReZero. But the tone that they're making him strike is a little bit odd to me. He just comes off as really condescending all the time, and that might be because he's talking to this dude who he considers to be dumb. But I feel like that kind of cocky attitude doesn't really jive well if you're going for a shonen protagonist, because you want them to be somewhat endearing, and you want to be able to root for them at some point. And I just feel like even if he got beat up, I wouldn't feel too bad about it, just because he's been so cocky about everything this whole time. And that was from the very beginning when he was in that science experiment lab or whatever, doing some chemistry stuff. And we already, from the very get-go, knew that he was going to be smart because he was working with some crazy machinery when other people were just pouring chemicals into beakers and stuff like that. And his hair was insane even before he got out of the stone world. Let's just acknowledge that shonen hair has gotten out of control. This dude has 6 feet of hair on top of his head. We're just making characters that look good on the cover of Shonen Jump now because there's no other way to entice people to read your manga other than just making the character look as outrageous as possible. Compare that to his sidekick who just looks like a normal person who's jacked for no reason, but he's still normal. Talking about that guy, he's voiced by the guy who did the voice for Saitama in One Punch Man, but that voice actor has some range, doesn't he? Because he's been doing just low-key Saitama, expressionless, completely monotone. And then he does this guy who just screams like the main character of Black Clover every 10 seconds. So shout out to that guy for having some kind of range. Just to talk about the art style a little bit, I didn't find the character designs overly appealing, to be honest. The main character looks somewhat cool. And all the characters have this weird thing above their eye, like a scar that goes into their eye or whatever. I don't know what that is, probably a holdover from the manga. We barely caught a glimpse of the main girl, and she looks in a completely different art style than the 2 other main boys, and I don't know why that's the case. And she just looks very much like, if you've seen any late 2000s or early 2010s kind of main girl, she looks vaguely like that. I don't exactly know how old this manga is or when it was first published, but it just feels a little bit out of place compared to the character designs that we have today. For example, if you saw a show last season called Sarazanmai, all the girls in that look very different from this, or if you watch TBK Euphonium or anything else where they use more a modern style for the character designs, it looks just completely different from this show. That being said, the art wasn't that bad. The backgrounds were very vast and kind of expansive, but they weren't overly detailed, which I found kind of defeated the purpose of doing that. If you're going to show a very large landscape and just have vague blobs of greenery, I feel like it really detracts from the effect of being able to see everything. And it might just be a time thing, because how much time can you spend really drawing the backgrounds? And I felt they weren't 3D, so I felt like they did spend some time on it in the first place, just drawing it. But they didn't spend a lot of time on the backgrounds and making the whole return to nature thing more than just an aesthetic, making it more thematic in it almost. And that is what the show is about at the end of the day. It's about a return to nature, nature takes over everything. I do have a few questions about the stonening. I don't know what else to call it. Everything just turned to stone. For some reason, birds turned to stone, but the other animals don't, because we saw a deer. It could also be that the deer just woke up like everybody else is doing currently at the moment, and that all animals were frozen. But at the first, in one scene, there was this little girl holding a dog, and the dog was not turned to stone. So I have some questions about that, because the dog is not that much bigger than that bird, but a deer is significantly bigger than both of them. So is it more like these are all like technical details that probably we should just accept, like suspension of disbelief. And I'm fine with works like that. This seems to fall into one of those categories of genres, which is like, just accept that the inciting incident happened, and from then we can move on to like solving the problem. An example of this that happened in recent years would be The Martian, where the windstorm that like leaves him deserted on Mars in the first place is kind of unbelievable and wouldn't really happen. But then after that, everything he does is like mostly scientifically accurate, and it seems like that's what's going to happen with this show. But I feel like we're missing a few things on attention to detail, which I really wish they had paid more attention to maybe. One of those things was when he first said how he knew what year it was and what date it was. He said he'd just been counting the whole time. I feel like that was a really dumb way to show that he's smart, because most of the show is about just finding out how to reconstruct society from first principle, right? And from first principle means you don't have any tools or anything. You're starting from zero, but you do have knowledge. And it seems like counting doesn't really convey that he has knowledge. It conveys that he has just an untiring ability to count. It just seems very tedious and not very smart in the first place. Work smart, not hard, after all, at the end of the day. I feel like if he had like charted the constellations. By the way, this is going to get super nerdy, so let's just do this. The Earth has a precession. It proceeds about its orbit every like so many years, I think 10,000 years or something. So you can actually look at how much the constellations have moved in the sky relative to where you were when you went into stone, and then you would know how many thousands of years it's been. I don't know exactly how accurate that is, because you'd have to know the degrees and whatnot, but you could get a rough idea of how many years it's been. And I feel like if he'd done something like that, that would have been way more impressive to me as a like casual viewer than like, oh, I counted 116 million seconds or whatever it is, because anybody can count. I mean, it takes some determination to stay counting, but it doesn't really take any intelligence to count, because everybody knows that 3 comes after 2 and whatnot. But it takes some intelligence to like, oh, look, the North Pole has moved this many degrees or whatever. So that would have been interesting for me to see. Other than that, we've seen like some of the first principles of him making like fire with wood, which again I question, because he has spears, and if he has spears, that means he has access to stone tools, and he could just get flint and a piece of metal and make that. Maybe he doesn't have metal yet. That's a good point. I feel like you could find metal lying around, because there's so much metal before. Anyway, it seems like the time gap is to just effectively remove all previous human relics from the world, and then we have to start over from zero. I'm perfectly happy to do that. It actually seems pretty cool that they chose to do that, and the main conflict seems to be between these two, who have kind of like an of mice and men dynamic between the two of them, where one is the brains and one is the brawn, and one insists that he is the brawn and will not learn anything. I feel like because he's the brawn and refuses to understand and learn anything, the explanations that the other guy gives seem a little bit jilted to me. For example, if he was very curious in learning stuff, then it would make more sense that the main character does explain stuff to him. But now it just seems like he's explaining it to us, which kind of like suspension of disbelief is a little bit off there. The main girl survived in the tree, so the tree grew to like enormous proportions in the thousands of years it's been since they went under, and that's good to see that she's still okay. I wonder what happens to the people that are in pieces now. Can you glue them back together and then they're fine, or are they just completely lost? We only got a glimpse of the main villain or antagonist, it seems, and I only know this because I watched the 2 PVs that came out before this. The main villain seems to be like an anarchist kind of guy. He's like the strongest survive on their own type, whereas these two clearly seem to be in the category of if we cooperate together, we can probably accomplish more than if we didn't. You can see that obviously with them like making huts and wine and all these things. It seems funny to me that their first concern is for making wine when the winter was coming up, and he said we need food to survive the winter because we can't really gather any food. We seem to have skipped over that step though, which is cool. I feel like if the influence of nature on early man was probably way more intense than it is for us now, because we don't really care. We can just go inside and turn up the heat or turn on the AC and we can be fine. But way back in the day, winter and spring, which he acknowledges that he woke up in spring because spring is the best time to get started making a new society because the weather is good and there's more materials available. I wish they had said something about planning for winter, like, oh, we're going to store food. But at the end of the day, it's still like geared towards a younger readership than me. So I do forgive it for some of its like toning down of the kind of highbrow intellectual stuff. I do wonder like how much of that they're going to include, because he has a lot of knowledge about chemistry and stuff like that, indicated to us by him being in a chemistry lab before the incident, but he doesn't really seem to, or he hasn't displayed any other sort of knowledge. Like he did make fire with wood, but he hasn't like constructed anything very large. You'd need some kind of mechanics or physics understanding to do that, or he hasn't made like a boulder device or a trap or anything like that, which I'm assuming we're going to see when they eventually start going into the battles of this show, just because this like guy who he calls a big oaf isn't going to be doing all the battling. I'm assuming we're going to have some kind of smart intellectual face-off between the two main characters. Otherwise, what's the point of having a smart main character in the first place? Okay. Other than that, it seems a little early in the first episode already to have figured out the solution to how to remove people from their stone prisons. It seems to me like it's just erosion, which is actually a pretty cool concept to me. It's cooler than just waking up for no reason, like a Passengers type deal where you just wake up and nobody else has woken up and you're trying to figure out why you woke up. This is a very simple explanation in this world, and that's just erosion. He was in a bat cave and he was getting dripped on with acid, and that's why he woke up faster than everyone else. Why Senku woke up faster, we don't really know yet. But he has figured out by mixing these two things, he can make a corrosive agent that's able to break this mineral and free people from their prisons, so to speak. It seems like the creator of the manga is very interested in chemistry, or the concept that you can just make things from nothing and those things have uses, and that seems to be the main focus of the show. I did hear a little bit more about this show from like watching videos that other people made on it about what to expect going forward, and they did talk about making penicillin and all these kind of cool things. I want to see what happens when more people wake up and they form societies of their own and these two encounter them, or is it going to be more like when they wake up they just get incorporated into the society that Taiju and Senku are making? If it works like that, I'm good with either one. I also hope that they kind of explore like the political aspect of that, like, oh, how do we administrate this village? Like, oh, is it going to be like a chief and a deputy chief and then they just tell you what to do, or is it more like a council based on what, we're not just building society and the technology from the ground up, we're also building society again from the ground up in terms of civilization and all those things. So I just thought those are kind of the interesting points about this episode. As far as episode 1s go, it did a fairly good job of introducing the two main characters. As I said before, I don't really find the main guy very intriguing, or not intriguing, I should probably say endearing. Taiju is more, endearing because we know his main motivation and what it is. Even if it is a cliche motivation, at least he has a motivation. Senku doesn't really seem to have any motivation other than he wants to prove that he's the smartest boy in the world by making all technology again. If he eventually does make a rocket at the end of like volume 5 or whatever, I'm gonna flip, just because there's so much technology involved in that it just seems unrealistic. You'd need a whole society cooperating together to get something of that magnitude off the ground. There's a pun. So I am looking forward to this season. I kind of want to see where they end up reaching in terms of their technological advancement, because if they start making metal tools and things like that, they could probably go a lot further than we can probably even imagine. Just because they have all the knowledge already. They don't have to go through all the steps. Like he said, it took 2 million years last time to go from Stone Age to Modern Age. This time it's probably going to take much, much less. So an interesting first episode to start off with, no doubt. The music and stuff I didn't feel were very unique or anything like that. And even the character designs I already said were not that great, but for a show that's really about ideas, it seems to me like it did a good job letting the ideas carry the bulk of the load of the show and keeping it interesting. That little time lapse at the end there was pretty cool. It felt like watching a Primitive Tools YouTube video or something. I knew about fractional distillation, but I didn't know that you could do it in a clay pot like that, which was pretty cool. It's also cool that it exploded, because you can't get everything right on the first try. Even though they do seem to be getting most things right on the first try, I do want to see them go through that trial and error process. I am questioning whether it would have been more interesting if they had not figured out how to free people from their stone prisons in episode 1 and had to keep trying out new things, because we could have learned more chemical stuff and it just seemed more interesting that way. But if this is what the plot necessitates, and maybe we're going towards a more like bigger society because they can free more people, that's fine with me too. So that's it for episode 1. Stay tuned for more summer anime reviews. I haven't really figured out what I'm going to be watching this week or this season. The only things I've seen so far are this show and To the Abandoned Sacred Beasts, which I'll be covering episode 2 next week, I think. So thank you for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you next week.